There's a concept in Carl Jung's analytical psychology that Jordan Peterson considers the most terrifying challenge any human being can face: confronting their own shadow. For normal people, this is already extraordinarily difficult. For a narcissist, it's literally apocalyptic. A narcissist's shadow doesn't just contain repressed impulses or minor flaws. It contains decades of systematic destruction, calculated manipulation, and deliberately inflicted suffering on others. Peterson revealed what happens when a narcissist is forced to confront this monstrous shadow, and the resulting breakdown is so devastating that it can literally shatter a person forever. If you want to understand what's really going on inside a narcissist's mind when the mask falls, subscribe to the channel, like it, and comment below if you already suspected that one day this collapse would happen. The narcissistic shadow is not like the shadow of normal people. While most people repress embarrassing or socially unacceptable impulses, narcissists repress entire systems of destructive behavior they've enacted for decades. Peterson, drawing heavily on Carl Jung's work on shadow integration, discovered that a narcissist's shadow contains not only what they refuse to see about themselves, but also what they currently deny knowing is true. É uma distinção crucial que Peterson faz. Most people have shadows que contain impulses they're unaware of. Narcissistas have shadows que contain behaviors they're fully conscious of, but have developed elaborate psychological mechanisms to deny, rationalize, or reframe. Their shadow isn't unconscious, actively suppressed through constant mental effort. Mas você consegue imaginar o psychological energy required to suppress awareness of decades of deliberate destructiveness? Segundo estudos em neuropsicologia, maintaining this level of cognitive dissonance creates what Peterson calls shadow pressure, uma psychological tension that builds over time. It can eventually reach critical mass. When that pressure finally overwhelms their suppression mechanisms, the result não é gradual awareness, explosive decompression. Like suddenly opening a pressure cooker that has been building steam for decades. The contents don't emerge gradually. They explode outward with devastating force. And then, the shadow emerges with all its destructive force. Peterson descreve esse momento como uma das experiências most psychologically devastating que ser humano pode endure. It's not just seeing your flaws or recognizing your mistakes. It being confronted simultaneously come every manipulative action you've taken, every person you've deliberately hurt, every relationship you've systematically destroyed, all while being unable to deny, rationalize, you escape from the reality of who you really are. Imagine por momento having to confront not just individual bad behaviors, but an entire lifetime pattern of predatory manipulation. Not just having hurt someone occasionally, but having systematically identified and exploited the vulnerabilities of almost everyone you've encountered. Not just having made mistakes, but having deliberately chosen destruction over healing in countless situations. Mas será que all narcissistas are capable of surviving this kind of shadow confrontation? Peterson's research reveals something profoundly disturbing. A maioria simply cannot. The psychological shock of confronting their complete shadow simultaneously is too overwhelming para most narcisistas to process without complete psychological fragmentation. Você consegue imaginar discovering que your entire psychological structure was designed specifically to avoid uma truth que, quando finally confronted, literally threatens your sanity? Peterson explains que some narcissistas, quando forced to confront their shadow completely, experience what he calls shadow shock, uma dissociative state onde they temporarily lose all sense of personal identity. Let us know in the comments if you've ever witnessed someone experiencing this kind of identity dissolution when confronted with the full extent of their shadow. O primeiro estágio do shadow confrontation, que Peterson calls shadow recognition, are characterized by a period of intense psychological resistance. Unlike normal people who might gradually become aware of repressed aspects of themselves, narcissists experience their shadow emerging all at once, like a dam breaking. The result, a overwhelming, often paralyzing. Peterson documented cases onde narcisistas, quando first confronted com their complete shadow, enter states que resemble severe dissociative episodes. They may spend days, weeks, essentially non-functional, unable to reconcile their grandiose self-image come the reality of their destructive shadow. Mas o que comes after this initial shock pode ser even more devastating. Peterson describes what he calls shadow integration crisis, onde the narcisista realizes that they cannot simply acknowledge their shadow and then continue as before. True shadow integration requires fundamentally restructuring their entire personality, their entire way of relating to others, their entire understanding of themselves. For most people, shadow work involves integrating relatively manageable aspects of themselves that they've kept hidden. For narcissistas, shadow integration would require essentially becoming a completely different person, abandoning not just behaviors, but the entire psychological framework that has defined their existence for decades. Mas o que happens next vai te chocar profundamente. Peterson revealed that even narcissistas who seem to confront their shadow often find ways to avoid true integration. Instead of genuinely incorporating their shadow into a more complete sense of self, they develop what he calls shadow performance. And they acknowledge their destructive aspects, must use that acknowledgement as a new form of manipulation. They become the reformed narcissista who talks openly about their dark side, who admits to their manipulative tendencies, who uses their apparent honesty about their shadow as a way to gain trust and admiration. A shadow work turned into performance, using even genuine self-recognition as a tool for continued control. E aqui está a parte most terrifying. According to Peterson, muitos narcisistas develop what he calls shadow grandiosity, where they become proud of having a particularly dark or complex shadow. They use their capacity to confront difficult truths about themselves as evidence of their superiority over others who are too weak to face their own darkness. Você consegue imaginar being so invested in grandiose self-perception that even your own destructiveness becomes a source of pride? Peterson describes casos onde narcisistas essentially become proud of their ability to manipulate, proud of their emotional intelligence and exploiting others, proud of their sophistication and psychological warfare. Mas deixa eu te contar something that will completely change your perspective on narcissistic shadow work. According to Peterson's research, exists a crucial difference between narcisistas who confront their shadow and fragment permanently, e aqueles who somehow manage to achieve genuine integration. The difference lies in the capacity to maintain what Peterson calls humble horror, being able to see your shadow clearly, accept full responsibility para all the destruction it contains, and still maintain enough psychological coherence to function, or change behavior, all without transforming that process into a new source of grandiosity. Peterson argues that this kind of genuine shadow integration is extraordinarily rare in narcissistas because it requires dismantling the very psychological mechanisms that define narcissistic personality structure. It's not just changing behaviors, but fundamentally altering the basic framework of how they process information about themselves and their relationships. Então, surge uma question que few have the courage to explore. Será que forcing someone to confront a shadow, this dark and extensive, ethical? Peterson, com his deeply pragmatic but humane perspective, suggests that the alternative, allowing them to continue operating from their unconscious shadow while causing systematic harm to others are even less ethical. But he also acknowledges that forcing narcissistic shadow confrontation is extremely dangerous. Unlike other forms of psychological work could generally lead to healing growth, narcissistic shadow confrontation can lead to permanent psychological damage, severe depression, or even suicidal ideation. Masochista something that will leave you completely disturbed. Peterson revealed that even narcissistas who successfully confront and integrate their shadow, who undergo genuine personality transformation, who become fundamentally different people, even these individuals rarely can fully repair the damage their shadow caused while it was operating unconsciously. Some wounds sont permanentes. Some relationships cannot be rebuilt. Some consequences sont irreversibles. This means that genuine shadow integration para narcisistas comes como a component of existential grief, mourning not just para what they lost, mas para what they destroyed irreparably in others, while operating from their unconscious shadow. Peterson describes cases onde narcissistas, upon achieving genuine shadow integration, developed what he calls shadow grief, a profound mourning not just for their own lost opportunities, mas para the permanent damage they inflicted on others while their shadow was running their behavior unconsciously. This grief could be so overwhelming that it leads to severe depression lasting years. Some individuals, upon fully confronting their shadow, become so overwhelmed by guilt or responsibility that they withdraw completely from social interaction, unable to risk causing further harm. Leave your thoughts below. Can someone psychologically survive fully confronting decades of unconscious destructive behavior? Peterson's answer is cautiously optimistic for a tiny minority. It documents extremely rare cases onde narcisistas manage to achieve genuine shadow integration, accepting full responsibility, para their destructive patterns while maintaining enough psychological stability to function, and make amends where possible. But these individuals share a specific characteristic. They completely abandon any attempt to gain recognition, admiration, or validation para their shadow work. They don't talk about their insights, don't seek credit para their growth, don't try to impress others com their transformation. Instead, they quietly dedicate themselves to minimizing future harm, quando possible, making practical amends without expectation of forgiveness. Y aquí está something que no one tells you about narcissistic shadow work. It often requires complete social isolation during the integration process. The psychological work of integrating decades of destructive behavior while maintaining stability is so intensive that many individuals cannot handle normal social interaction during this period. Peterson frequently works com families, helping them understand que genuine shadow integration in narcissistas could require months or years of minimal contact, while the individual processes the full extent of their destructive patterns without being triggered back into defensive behaviors by social interaction. Ponto que você vai descobrir now will transform your understanding of timing and intervention. Peterson revealed that narcissistic shadow confrontation cannot be scheduled, programmed, or forced through external pressure. It happens quando the individual's psychological defenses can no longer maintain suppression of their shadow material against overwhelming internal pressure. Attempting to force shadow confrontation could result in greater resistance, more elaborate defense mechanisms, or in worst cases, psychological fragmentation can make genuine integration impossible. The shadow emerges quando it's psychologically safe to do so, not quando others decide it should. This means that families of narcissistas often find themselves in an impossible position, knowing that shadow integration might be necessary para a genuine change, mas being unable to control quando or if it will happen safely rather than destructively. Peterson também warns about something deeply disturbing. Nossa contemporary society makes genuine shadow work extremely difficult para everyone. mas especially para narcisistas. Social media, superficial therapy culture, self-help movements que promise transformation. Without real psychological work, everything conspires to allow people to believe they're doing shadow work when they're actually avoiding it. Aquí está the final question que will haunt you. If genuine narcissistic shadow integration is so rare and so potentially dangerous, what does this mean para the people who have been hurt by narcissistas operating from their unconscious shadows? Peterson suggests that most victims will never see their abusers achieve genuine shadow integration. Most will never receive complete acknowledgement, you see, lasting behavioral change. This places an enormous burden on victims. They must find healing without waiting. Para shadow work may never happen. You may be performed rather than genuine. É uma harsh reality. Mas Peterson argues que waiting para narcissistas to do genuine shadow work can keep victims trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment indefinitely. The ultimate message is paradoxical. Find strength in doing your own shadow work, understanding your own capacity para manipulation, your own tendencies toward grandiosity, your own unconscious destructive patterns. Because true protection from narcissistas comes not from waiting para them to confront their shadows, mas from becoming conscious of your own shadow material that makes you vulnerable to their manipulation. Real shadow work isn't about fixing others, it's about becoming so conscious of your own psychological patterns that you can recognize and respond appropriately to unconscious destructiveness in others without being drawn into their psychological systems. You're waiting para them to change. Se você chegou até aqui, você é beginning to understand que dealing effectively com narcissistas requires doing your own psychological work, rather than waiting para theirs. No próximo vídeo, vamos explore how Jordan Peterson analyzes what happens quando narcissistas finally break under the weight of their own psychological contradictions, and why this breaking could be either liberation or complete destruction. Subscribe and hit the bell, porque this journey está revealing truths about human psychology that will forever change how you understand the nature of genuine transformation versus performance of change.